We're going to talk about is the Environmental Protection Act and the Sun Belt. So the EPA was started to protect and clean the environment. I think that's something that we're all pretty familiar with. It was trying to limit or eliminate pollutants. So you had like clean air, clean water, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, things you probably learned about in elementary school. We also at the same time had a lot of Americans moving south and west. So I mean, that includes where we are now, we're in Florida. So you had, if you look at this migration, you'll see the light green is saying they had a 0 to 10% gain, and then you have the purple is showing a loss of population, while the light yellow is a 10% to 30% gain in population, the medium yellow 30 to 50%, and then the orange 50 to 70%. So look how many people moved to like Nevada, Florida got a huge increase, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Alaska. We had a lot of people moving out of really the Northeast and the Midwest, moving west and moving south. So it was big changes during that time. Also big changes going on with our relations with China. Nixon really wanted to establish diplomatic relations with China. Trade began to thrive. American tourists began to visit China in larger numbers. The Soviet leader at the time also invited Nixon to visit Moscow. It was a big deal. We're still in the Cold War, right? I mean, this Cold War started pretty much right after World War II. So really early 50s, you see the Cold War really kicking off, and it was very tense. Remember, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in Kennedy's presidency. So it started to cool off a little during this time, during the 70s. One of the biggest things that you guys need to remember, or just as a general thing that you should know as a, adult, Nixon's policy with the Cold War was détente. So just kind of a stalemate, trying to ease Cold War tensions and take the tension down and decrease the threat level. So despite the fact that Nixon won a pretty strong election in 1972, what was kind of the beginning of the end for him actually started during his campaign in the 1972 election. So there was a break-in of the Democratic National Committee headquarters in June of 1972. This was the Watergate scandal. It's called Watergate because the hotel is the Watergate Hotel. And that changed everything for Nixon. It was revealed that the people that broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters were actually working for Nixon's reelection committee, and he had secret tapes of what they were talking about. He had them in the Oval Office. So they made a clear connection to him that he was part of this break-in, he knew about it, and they had proof that he knew about it. So the Watergate scandal was really at the beginning of the end for Nixon. He actually had a nickname. They would call him Tricky Dicky because his name was Richard Nixon. The first thing that really happened in this is he refused to give over the tapes, citing executive privilege in order to protect this information. People have made comparisons to the current presidency and this situation. I'm not sure. I don't have enough information to know how closely related they could possibly be, but there are people making allusions to a comparison between the situation with Nixon and current situation. There was a Supreme Court case, the United States versus Nixon, and the court ordered that Nixon had to turn the tapes over, that being president didn't eliminate or didn't mean that he could do whatever and withhold this information. And then the tapes did prove Nixon's involvement in the cover-up of the break-in. So a House committee voted to impeach him. And then instead of dealing with the impeachment, Nixon decided to resign in 1974. So he's the only president to ever resign. So remember, impeachment doesn't necessarily mean, like we've gone through that this year, right? Impeachment doesn't necessarily mean that a president is ousted. It's just a process for investigating. And then we have some cartoons on here. So if you look at this, like what's the main idea of this? Well, we know the story of Pinocchio, right? Kept lying. And then one of the things that a famous quote from Nixon was, "I am not a crook." So it's showing him falling and it says, "I am a crook," right? It took the knot out, and it's the tapes he's holding onto the tapes. You guys might not have seen those before, but those are like tape reels. Enter Gerald Ford. So how did he become president? Well, Nixon's vice president resigned, and then Nixon appointed Gerald Ford. So when Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford became president. So that's how he became president. So we also had a lot of economic instability in the 70s. There's a 1973 oil crisis. So my mom remembers in the 70s, because that's when she was in high school, and I think she graduated in 73 and went to college, that there would be this insane gas shortage because there were these price controls where they set the prices for gas. As a result, the gas stations didn't want to sell it, so there wasn't any available. So you had to only go get gas during certain times based on your license plate. So there was an oil embargo, which they like banned oil shipments to the United States by OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, because the United States supported Israel in the Arab-Israeli war. So this was a political byproduct, but they were using oil as a kind of a bargaining chip. This is like a line to go get gas, like lines insanely long. People would pay people to wait in line for them. They stretched for blocks. So the supply decreased. So oil prices skyrocketed because the supply decreased. But the government kind of did the wrong thing and ended up setting price controls where they kept the price artificially low, which made the problem even worse. One of the big problems in the 70s, which is a uniquely bad problem, is something called stagflation. So stagflation means that prices are going up and unemployment is going up. Both of those things going up at the same time is almost impossible for the government to try to fix. They can usually try to fix one of those things at a time. You can either fix inflation or you can try to fix unemployment. It's difficult to try to fix both at the same time because there's different ways to fix them. So you have both of those things going up. So the 70s was a really tough time. I know my mom said when she bought her first house, the interest rate was like 15 or 16%. And I'm getting ready to buy one and it's going to be under 4. So it was a very different time economically. And inflation is when prices are rising for everything, not just one thing, but for everything. And then the national unemployment rate, for us recently, it was 4.4%, but the unemployment rate in the 70s. So if you look here, the unemployment rate is in red. It was up to like 7.5 maybe, and inflation was up to 13%. So we want to keep inflation to 1 or 3%. Like this was pretty crazy having inflation up here. All right, the Ford years, still continuing the policy of détente. Disarmament talks with the Soviets, Helsinki Accords. It was an agreement that promised cooperation between Eastern and Western Europe, so trying to help Eastern and Western Europe mend some fences, gun control over human rights. All right, let's talk about Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter is a one-term president, and the economy was really struggling. You had all the stuff with Nixon, so Gerald Ford became president without being elected. The economy was really struggling. There's a phrase people say that people vote their pocketbooks. So no matter what they think about a president, if the economy is bad, typically people will get rid of a president. If the inflation is high, if unemployment is high, if the GDP is low, people will tend to vote for the other party. So Jimmy Carter won in the 1976 election, and he called himself the citizens' president. So he didn't have any ties to professional politicians. And people really were like sick of politicians after Nixon and Watergate. But he wasn't very effective for kind of the same reason. He was new, so he didn't really have allies in Washington. And he didn't really get a lot of things passed. And he granted amnesty to Americans who had evaded the draft. People that were draft dodgers, he granted amnesty to them, and a lot of people did not really agree with that. Jimmy Carter's still alive. He still builds, he's in his 90s and he builds habitat houses. He's a pretty, I think after his presidency, people have realized that he was a very admirable person, but during his time as a president, he didn't get as much accomplished as other presidents have in the past. One of the things that was the most momentous during his presidency was the Camp David Accords, where it was the beginnings of peace between Egypt and Israel. And then SALT II, which was an arms control treaty. So continuing to try to decrease tension around the world. This situation was actually one of the is a very important part of American history, the Iran hostage crisis. So we talked about this during the year, how the United States has sometimes interjected itself into other nations, like leadership and trying to overthrow other leaders. Remember, we did that in Cuba with Fidel Castro, and that's one of the reasons that things went so badly so quickly with Cuba. But the Muslim leader Ayatollah Khomeini, he overthrew the Shah of Iran, and the United States had backed the Shah of Iran. So armed students took over the U.S. embassy and took 66 hostages. And one of the big things was the exchange. Trying to get these hostages back became a big problem. I think it was 444 days. I think it was how many days they kept these hostages. So this is something new, this conflict with the Middle East becoming a major concern to America. The rescue attempt failed. Hostages were held for 444 days, but the hostages were released the day that Reagan was sworn in, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This is a movie that came out a couple years ago called Argo. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to hear it, but I'm going to play the preview for you.
Shocked the civilized world. Threat every day. Our embassy has been seized and more than 60 American citizens continue to be held as hostages. If we're going to go, then we need to go now. What happened? 6 of the hostages went out a back exit. Where are they? The Canadian ambassador's house. We got Revolutionary Guards going door to door. These people die. They die badly. White House wants the 6 of them out. What we like for this are bicycles. Deliver the 6 bikes, provide them with maps. Or you could just send in training wheels and meet them at the border with Gatorade. It's going to take a miracle to get them out. What are we watching? I got an idea. They're a Canadian film crew for a science fiction movie. I fly into Tehran. We all fly out together as a film crew. I need you to help me make a fake movie. So you want to come to Hollywood and act like a big shot without actually doing anything? Yeah, you'll fit right in. You need a script. Fargo, science fantasy adventure. Moon State, Mars, desert. You need an exotic location to shoot. You need a producer. If I'm doing a fake movie, it's going to be a fake hit. Better bad idea than this? This is the best bad idea we have, sir. By far. You have 72 hours to get them out. They're getting a visitor.
You gotten people out this way before?
No. They're asking us to trust you with our lives. This is what I do. And I've never left anyone behind. Oh, I know that. It's over, Tony. Not a lot. We're responsible for these people. Story is going to make a difference when there's a gun to our heads. I think my little story is the only thing between you and a gun to your head.
So that was based on a true story, based on the attempt to get people out. The hostages were released. We'll talk more about that next week because that involves Reagan, and we're going to talk about Reagan next week. The last thing we're going to talk about, so in '79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The U.S. did impose sanctions. They boycotted the Olympic Games in Moscow. And so remember we talked about this, some of the weapons that they had in Afghanistan were American weapons, but there is a history of conflict between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. So we'll talk more about that later as well. But so of course, the Cold War not over, tensions with the Soviet Union definitely not over yet. It had de-escalated, but still was continuing during this time. So let's